Role-playing? That's so 6 episodes ago. The new hotness is scroll-playing, baby. It's NES Works episode 141. The NES release schedule has gotten a little weird here in August of 1989, with lots of similar or similarly named games piling up all at once. We saw that in action last episode, with 2 games that had Castle in the title. And we see it again this episode with King's Knight and the Adventures of Dino-Riki. This is a real Knightmare duo, by which I mean they're kind of nightmarish to play and I hate them, but also, both of them owe a tremendous debt to Konami's MSX game, Knightmare, with a K. We've seen Knightmare in passing over on Metroidvania works in the context of exploring its sequel, the exploration-based platform adventure Maze of Gallius. The original Knightmare was nothing like that. Instead, it took the form of an auto-scrolling shooter that landed at the midpoint of Capcom's Commando and Namco's Dragon Spirit. Though, now that I've looked it up, I see that Knightmare actually predated Dragon Spirit by a year, so maybe it was more influential than I initially even realized. You can understand its appeal, though. Knightmare landed on MSX in early 1986, right in time to perfectly capitalize on a lot of different hot trends. For starters, you had the ground-based forward-scrolling vertical shooting game, which had gotten off to a jerky, awkward, annoying start with Taito's Frontline a few years earlier, but found a pair of more worthwhile avatars with Commando and Sega's Ninja Princess in 1985. At the same time, Knightmare seized on the rise of the role-playing genre among Japan's console gaming fanatics. Granted, the MSX was more of a computer than a console, but it straddled the line between the formats due to its cartridge-based media, innards that amounted to a juiced-up SG-1000 or ColecoVision, and its popularity among breakout gaming publishers, like Konami. The MSX library had a tremendous influence on console game design, easily more than any other computer at the time. So when a game like Knightmare came along, which neatly bridged the distance between 2 seemingly disparate genres like shooters and role-playing games, you can bet that tuned-in game designers sat up and took notice. That clearly includes designers at Squaresoft and Hudson, specifically Square's Hironobu Sakaguchi and Hudson's Sakurada Meijin, the men behind the design of King's Knight and Dino-Riki. Now, to my knowledge, Sakaguchi has never explicitly called Knightmare an inspiration for King's Knight, but come on. Knightmare involved a little knight who marched through forced-scrolling combat zones, firing various mystical weapons at swarms of bad guys while navigating terrain, avoiding water hazards, and blasting the scenery in order to reveal power-ups and entrances to dungeons. King's Knight involves 4 little guys, including a knight who march through forced-scrolling combat zones, firing various mystical weapons at swarms of bad guys while navigating terrain, avoiding water hazards, and blasting the scenery in order to reveal power-ups and entrances to dungeons. Like Knightmare's little guy, the little guys in King's Knight have a health meter to soak up damage from enemy attacks, and can gather icons in order to upgrade their weapons, speed, and more. It's not a true role-playing game in that you don't need to gather experience points, and you have almost no player agency whatsoever, but the superficial styling absolutely riffs on the groundswell of enthusiasm for the medium that took hold of Japan's kids in the mid-80s. I mean, Knightmare showed up just a month after the debut of the Famicom Disk System and The Legend of Zelda, and not too long after The Tower of Druaga. And in between the arrival of Knightmare in March 1986 and King's Knight in September, which is just long enough for someone to successfully play, clone, and release a new game on the abbreviated development cycles of the mid-80s, Sakaguchi, you had the arrival of Highlight Special on Famicom, the debut of Namco's Valkyrie no Boken, and this other little game called Dragon Quest. What I'm saying is that King's Knight was extremely on trend. And let's not overlook the fact that its 4-character party of adventurers shooting enemies and hidden stuff seems highly reminiscent of Atari's Gauntlet, a game that did see limited release in Japanese game centers in 1986 and certainly caught the eye of a certain brand of hardcore developer, which is to say that you can find an original Gauntlet cabinet in M2's offices outside of Tokyo. Now, we've already seen Squaresoft on NES back in 1987 with Rad Razor. In that Nintendo-published release, Square's team took a long, hard look at a popular game, Sega's Outrun, and said, let's do that with a little twist, in that case 3D. And that's what you'll find here in King's Knight. Square was hungry for a hit in 1986 and had no qualms about straight up lifting other studios' ideas as their own. That even includes business practices, as they would soon launch an Enix-style publishing label for Famicom Disk System called Disk Original Group, or DOG. So clearly when Knightmare came along, Square said, hey, let's do that with a little twist. And they did. King's Knight looks better and moves more smoothly than Knightmare, as is so often the case with NES iterations of MSX concepts. King's Knight would also show up a few months later on MSX, where it still looked better than Knightmare. And since Nobuo Uematsu composed the soundtrack, King's Knight was one of the rare Konami knockoffs that could punch on par sonically with an actual Konami game. As blatant clones go, King's Knight ranks among the better examples of the form. It even precedes Dragon Quest IV in its structure. You play as one of 4 characters in each of the game's first 4 chapters. And then everyone teams up to fight together through the 5th stage. You may also notice a bit of similarity with a future Sakaguchi release here, in that your party needs to seek out one of 4 elemental spells each in every one of the initial stages, and acquiring all 4 allows you to venture into the final area to take on the final boss. Each of the 4 characters plays a little differently from the rest. There's Rajak, the eponymous knight, who has great attack power and natural speed advantages. Stage 2 features Kaliva, a wizard with a knack for jumping. Stage 3 revolves around Barusa, not Borusa.
You are the notorious renegades.
A little Godzilla-looking dude who has great defensive ratings right out of the box. And finally, you have Toby. He's a thief, which means naturally he moves quickly. In the final stage, each character also gains access to the magic spell that they collected in their individual portion of the quest. When the team fights as a party, you control all 4 in tandem, with the current lead character determining the group's capabilities, including the current active magic spell. This makes the final stage work like something of a puzzle, as you can only use each character's elemental spell once, and you need them specifically to power through a certain challenge in that last stage. It's a little arbitrary and unforgiving, yes, but what do you expect from an RPG-inflected action game in 1986? This game hails from the same era as Milon's Secret Castle and Atlantis no Nazo. That's just how they rolled at that particular point in time. But there's the thing. In the US, King's Knight was not an RPG-inflected game in 1986. As in Japan, it arrived here in the same time frame as Dragon Quest, aka Dragon Warrior. And just like Dragon Warrior in America, feels decidedly archaic by the standards of a world in which the likes of Contra Bionic Commando and Mega Man 2 exist. It's not the worst thing we've ever seen on NES, and I do have to say that the Hayao Miyazaki-esque cover art looks great, and really stood out in an era during which US publishers viewed the prospect of showcasing original Japanese illustrations on their game boxes with mortal trepidation. But it's just a little too clunky and stilted to work as a shooter, and much too limiting to work as an action RPG. I have to imagine that King's Knight fared well on Famicom and MSX. The game did get a sequel in 2017 after all, due to its timely, on-trend release window. But so many games that built on or moved beyond King's Knight had already arrived on NES in the interim between Square's initial Japanese release and its American launch that it's hard to find much use for this. It's a barjack of multiple trades and a master of none, if you will. And kind of a weird choice for Squaresoft to use as its self-publishing debut in America, which is probably why they ultimately only ended up self-publishing 2 games on NES and let Nintendo do the heavy lifting for their proper role-playing adventure and King's Knight follow-up, Final Fantasy.
If medieval fantasy isn't your thing, well, why not play the exact same game, except with cavemen? Okay, The Adventures of Dino-Riki isn't 100% the same as King's Knight because it doesn't have that 4-character party system, but ultimately, this is basically just the caveman version of King's Knight.
Unlike Hironobu Sakaguchi, the designer between Dino-Riki has openly stated that he wanted to create a game in the Knightmare vein. And he did. That's precisely what Dino-Riki is, and it makes no apologies for it. The designer in question, Sakurada Meijin, was one of Hudson's game masters, like Toshiyuki Takahashi. That probably explains why Dino-Riki is so unforgiving.
It was calibrated to the tastes and skills of an expert player and cares not for you weaklings who want things like manageable design and level arrangements that you don't need to commit to memory in order to advance. The Adventures of Dino-Riki takes the same general format seen in Knightmare and King's Knight. You control another little guy, this time a caveman, as he marches along a vertical battlefield that scrolls forward automatically, shooting at things, collecting power-ups, and generally dying a lot. Compared to those knight-centric games, Dino-Riki presents you with a far more dangerous landscape to navigate. You need to deal with more and different instant kill hazards in each stage, and enemies spawn in locations with patterns that suggest the developers took notes from playtesting and adjusted those play elements to pop up in spots where players naturally gravitated. You can see this tendency in action as early as the first of the game's 4 stages, as you need to leap over a series of lily pads in order to avoid being dunked into the water, which will kill you instantly. You have only a couple of opportunities to hop across the pads that rise and sink in rhythm before they scroll off screen, and entire formations of enemies are set to show up and hit you in the most obvious safe landing spots at precisely the time that you would instinctively touch down from leaping off a sinking pad. It's pretty cruel, and to make matters worse, Dino-Riki doesn't mess with an RPG-style life meter, or with hit points to allow your little guy to soak up some damage. Dino-Riki is a primitive man, and that means he has only 2 hit points. You can bonks adventure it by collecting meat and heart icons along the way, adding more health to your sad little heart meter at the top of the screen. Alas, the sheer number of enemies and projectiles flooding the screen, the hatefully deliberate placement of attackers, and the fact that poor Riki gets blaster mastered with downgraded abilities anytime he takes damage makes it tough to build up a decent hit point reserve. In other words, while Dino-Riki mimics the appearance and form of Konami's Knightmare, it presents an entirely distinct playhook. This is not a proto-RPG in action form, it is a pure action shooter. You have only a single party member, Riki, and the action combines shooting, evasion, and something akin to platforming, with no quest or goals beyond keep going, don't die. You don't even have the option of revealing hidden passages to explore. Instead, Dino-Riki's hook allows you to go full Amagon. By finding hidden icons, you can transform Riki into his mighty form, a burly muscle man whose preferred form of attack is images of his own body? It's kind of weird, but it takes some doing to actually find those icons in the first place. So it would have been entirely possible to run this game for a weekend and never encounter Riki's ultimate upgrade. I suppose all these references I'm making to those other games does chalk up a small positive for Dino-Riki. It actually broke a lot of ground that would show up in other games. Other better games, it should be noted, most of which had already hit the US by the time Dino-Riki arrived on NES. Yes, Adventures of Dino-Riki is another very old game that belatedly made its way to NES long after it had been bested by other, more recent efforts that showed up later in Japan, but reached the state ahead of this, their inspiration. It's kind of a theme here in August 1989, what with Dragon Warrior also gracing our nation at the same time as Dino-Riki. Amagon and Blaster Master and Bonk's Adventure didn't exist when Dino-Riki made its Famicom debut. But 2 of those 3 games had already hit the States by this point, and they were frankly more entertaining than Hudson's game, which is pretty sad to think about with one of those games as Amagon, but so it goes. I can certainly see how Dino-Riki came to be. This game belonged to Hudson's caravan shooter side, and it offered an alternate take on vertical shooters like Takahashi Meijin's Star Soldier. And it probably worked in that context, which is to say, the context of a Famicom fanbase wired to revel in this kind of game 2.5 years before the NES release. Here on NES in the latter half of 1989, it really makes you question why Hudson even bothered localizing it, and if the studio even had the first clue about making games that would resonate with the NES fanbase. Luckily for Hudson, their next couple of games would offer a resounding yes, as we'll see in the next couple of episodes. Tiny previews for both King's Knight and Dino-Riki appeared in Nintendo Power's 7th issue. And that's it. Even they couldn't be arsed, it seems.
Next time on NES Works, like Hollow Notes said, I want to play that game tonight.